It's my honor and privilege tonight to introduce Mr. David Kendall, who's going to share with us some of the interesting stories of Changgyeong-gung, one of the main palaces in Seoul. Also, stories of what had been happened in that palace, involving also including Princess Caesar and Lady Hyeong in 1760s. Mr. Kendall majored economics and history at Indiana University, and he came to Korea for the first time in 1991. And developed an interest in Korea's efforts to promote international identity while working as an editor and writer for Europe News and Korea.net. Changgyeong-gung first caught his attention, and which eventually led him to write. Presently associated with the international law firm called Daryuk and Aju, and responsible for publications. So without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Kendall with a big round of applause.
Thank you, Mr. Che, and thank you, Darius, for this opportunity. Okay, I've been told, so I'm like a pop star here. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself as I do the presentation, but I'd like to go as quickly as I can. I have to confess that months ago when the RAS sent out a survey asking people to suggest speakers, I suggested myself. And I did that not because I'm such a great person or speaker, but I have attended RAS lectures through the years I lived in Korea. I know that the people here are very interested in learning about Korean history and culture. And even though I lived in Korea a long time, there was many things I didn't know about Changgyeong-gung or even Korea that I found out. So I wanted to share that with you. And most importantly, I want to hear from the people who lived in Seoul when, at the time when Changgyeong-gung was a zoo and park, to hear your stories. So I'm going to go quickly, so I want to have as much time for talking as I can. So this is from the present Changgyeong-gung brochure, and the lower part is actually what has a better sense of what it's like to be there. How many of you have visited Changgyeong-gung? Yeah, that's why I wanted to speak and people know. So I, like Mr. Che said, I came to Korea in 1991, and I never heard about Changgyeong-gung. I discovered it probably around 1997 on my 5th visit to the P1. And through this gate, it was open that day, so I wandered in here, and I thought, oh, what is this place? And you can see an oasis of quiet in the middle of Seoul, so I liked it, and I would visit periodically. But I did become passionate about it until I read this book. And how many of you have read this book? Oh, okay. Okay, good. I really encourage you, if you're interested in Korean history and culture, read this book. I rarely cry. This book made me cry. And I never had any sympathy for the Korean Yangban. This book gave me sympathy for the Korean Yangban. So the woman, they call her Lady Kendall. No one knows her name because in Korean Confucian culture, women's names were recorded in the book. But her father was a famous scholar, and she was selected at age 9 to marry Crown Prince Sado. So she went to the palace. In her book, she says it's the first time she saw her parents cry. And they weren't crying tears of joy. They knew what kind of life she was going to lead. So in Korea, a princess, it in the castle isn't like it is in the West. So many of you might know, her husband was Sado Seja, Crown Prince Sado, Emperor Cheongjo, also rice chess king. So one of the things I learned is how many names, places, and people in Korea have. And I understand the politics of it. I'm going to try to stick to just one name for simplification for all the people and places that I talk about. But, so I'm going to touch back on Lady Changgyeong later, but I highly encourage you to read this book. And inside the book, there's a small map of the palace. So I would read the book and then go and visit the palace find out the places that she was talking about. Some of them are still there. And magpies, she always talks about the magpies. And Changgyeong-gung has more magpies than any palace that I visited so far, still to date. But get on that later. So another reason why I wanted to speak to this group. So these are from travel guides. And the first one, nothing would strike Koreans as more inartistic than a collection of plants, however beautiful individually, arranged in a manner so wholly unnatural. Throw over the greater part of the scene the artistic touch of neglect and incipient ruin, and you have some idea of the grounds of the new palace of soul. So do you know what he's talking about there? P1, yes. Yeah. And the second, walk through the dense woodlands and suddenly come across a serene glade among the large ancient trees. Here are buildings on the edge of a square lily pond with other halls and a two-story library. The board out front, written by King Donggo, means gather the universe. Joseon kings relaxed, studied, and wrote poems in this strengthened setting. And what place is that? No? So, B1, yeah. Yeah, in that area. Well, that's the area of B1, it's hard. Yeah, they were very precise. So yeah, this one is B1. So the exact same place, and I'm sure their appearance didn't vary that much, but the descriptions vary incredibly. And that's what tourism studies is in a nutshell, that we don't actually see places. We all see impressions that have been given to us through books and movies and friends and family. So what we see depends on what we know about it and not really what it is. And so this is my thesis. I looked at the Changgyeong-gung over 3 periods, the colonial, authoritarian, and civilian, and how it changed, the buildings in those places. But more importantly, I did content analysis and discourse analysis. So I would actually look at books and count words, what words were used, look at photos, what photos were pictured, and to look at how this place was represented over time during these things. And another part of tourism studies is that the way descriptions are carried out is just shared through the host. The host is who is in charge of the site, and the visitors. So they exchange information and they come up with what the place actually is and what it looks like. And I didn't have that many guidebooks available, especially for the colonial period. So I needed something else. And things that stuck out when reading this are the women in Hamburg. That's something that Kendall wrote about a lot. So I look at pictures of the women in Hamburg and count them, and also other people in pictures of the palace. And as Mr. Shea said, the Hamburg story, how that was told within the guidebooks. And most interesting to me was the museum collection, because I had no idea there was a museum at Changgyeong-gung. Many Koreans had told me about the zoo and how a disgrace it was. No one ever mentioned the museum, so I was very surprised about that. And other things is palimpsest. Yeah, so do any of you know what the word palimpsest is? Yeah. Okay, do you want to answer?
Mixed.
Yeah, specifically it's about paper. So from papyrus, when paper was very expensive, the papyrus, you couldn't just discard it. You had to keep it. If new ideas came along, it would wash off the old ink and write over it. And palimpsest is the ink that you can barely see underneath the new ink writing. But this Hong-Gi-Yoon, he's a professor of geography at University of Auckland, he talks about palimpsest. I told you you would find out about me as I went along. So I went to grad school to see if I could become a PhD, and I discovered I cannot. I don't have what it takes. And now I work as a PR in a Korean law firm, and I also work the hours of a Korean lawyer. So I don't have time to write and memorize an hour speech. So key points I wrote down here. So I went to write about the art of palimpsest, writing over the landscape recently defeated with your own expressions of opulence. That's how Professor Yoon described it. And with that, we can move on to the first part, which is the Indo-Joseon in the colonial period. So this painting called Dongmo-do, the East Palace, shows Changgyeong-gung and Changgyeong-gung. And they were collectively known as the East Palace. And so this is Changgyeong-gung, and P1 is back here, and this is Changgyeong-gung. And can you tell the difference of the palaces? I mean, the buildings all look about the same, but what's different about them? The layout and the trees? No? I mean, that's true, but there's something specific that I know they both have dorm rooms. The thing is, Changgyeong-gung faces south, as all Confucian palaces do, because of geomancy, and Changgyeong-gung faces east. So, and why it faces east, it depends on what period you lived in. If you lived in the colonial period, you wouldn't know, because they didn't write about the history of the palace. They just had a museum and a zoo. If you lived in the authoritarian period, most of the guidebooks say that it faces east because this was a Koryo palace, and Koryo was a Buddhist kingdom, and this was a summer palace for Koryo. Once we get into the civilian period, you say it faces east because this is a Confucian palace, and the Donggyo shrine is here, and it would be very disrespectful to face the graves of your ancestors, so they made it face east. So again, how you see a place depends on what you're told about it, and what time you live in. So, and sorry, I keep going past it. So, yeah, if you have a question, you just write it down. Of course, at the end. Also, I wanted to tell you, if you like the thesis, you can read it. It's online. You used to be able to just search Kendall giraffe, and it would pop up. But now, if you do that, you'll see Kendall Jenner with a giraffe. So don't do that. If you do Kendall Changgyeong-gung giraffe, for sure you'll get the thesis. So, unless Kendall Jenner visits Changgyeong-gung. And the Japanese, as most of you know, annexed Korea in 1910. But this is a guidebook from Japan, and a lot of people here have read like Hobo in the Orient, so they're familiar that people traveling around Korea and Japan in the early 20th century by train or boat. This Welcome Society started in 1893. So, and again, I have some pieces I want to read to you. So the transformation of Changgyeong was a small part of a much larger picture, according to Changgyeong-pei. Japan's imperial treasury had been severely drained as a result of the numerous military campaigns from 1894 to 1905, with the war with Russia and the invasion of China. The Japanese were increasingly portrayed as bellicose and savage in the Western press, and tourism offered a way to soften this image and generate revenue. And so the Japanese Tourism Bureau would work with companies to put out this literature. And the Welcome Society stresses that it's not part of the Japanese government. They're just citizens that want to improve awareness of Japanese society. But among their pages are advertisements from companies that are tied to the Japanese government. So, and that's, I mention that because it'll come up later. So the Japanese Tourism Bureau was partnering with Japan's newspapers and railway concerns, began publishing tourist guides to imperial lands as soon as they were acquired. Seoul's palaces received barely a mention in the 1910 guide, released by the Welcome Society of Japan. A year later, Changgyeong was a well-trodden part of a recommended day tour of Seoul for those en route to Manchuria. So the Japanese were going around at the end of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, to find out as much as we could about Western society. And one of the things that interested us was expos, like the world expos that we still have now. Those had started. And Japan, there's an American writer, Miller, I forget his first name, but he's at Harvard, and he writes about the Japanese, especially Ueno Park. And he was talking about how most of the Western governments, when they would go to these expositions, they would spend a lot of money and it would be very expensive. The Japanese government actually made money when they went to the expositions. They would bring Japanese fans or little objects, and people would pay them. And from that, they made enough revenue to pay for all the transport of the objects, all the people. And when the exhibition was over, they sold their stand to like a restaurant in Paris that wanted a Japanese theme. So they were very clever at marketing the country from way back. And this is a 1915 exposition held in Seoul. And you can see that they put the main gate right in front of the Changgyeong-gung Palace. And this picture was one of the things that really amazed me, and I wanted to show it to people like you. From 1938 to 1945, Japan had the Imperial Airlines that would fly people, tourists, around the empire. So these are the routes, Tokyo and Seoul, on into Manchukuo. And this is Changgyeong-gung after in 1940. This came from my thesis, so I said, what is this? I didn't know what this place was. Later you'll find out, but I couldn't erase that when I tried to. So you can see that these are the main palace buildings that were left. And the zoo was here, so they tore down all the buildings here to make the zoo. They tore all the buildings down here to put a botanical garden. And I can show you these buildings. So this is what they built, the zoo. The building that I didn't know what it was the Yi Royal Archive, Yi, the family name, Chosun. And this is the museum that they built. So I was very surprised when I saw this picture, because I'd never seen pictures of this building before. And they also built the greenhouse, which is still there today. It's just recently remodeled. And what they called the Crystal Palace, which was the tea house and restaurants. And I outlined the buildings that were left after the Japanese period. And so then just taking a closer look at these buildings. So this is the Yi Royal Archive, Dansoka, and it was from 1915 to 1938. Then it became the Biological Specimen Hall. When animals died in the zoo, they would stop them and put them in this building. Excuse me, and it was demolished in 1983 when the park and the palace was restored. And this is the museum from 1911 to 1938. It was, sorry, that's wrong. So, from 1911 to 1938, oh, sorry, see, it was the Yi Royal Museum from 1911 to 1938, and the Royal Archive from 1938 to 1992, when it was destroyed. These are the only pictures I could find of the zoo from the colonial period. But I really liked these pictures, so I wanted to show them to you. And the zoo was from 1909 until 1993. And this is the Crystal Palace, Sudonga. And it's from 1912 to 1966. And the Grand Greenhouse is behind it, and it's still there. And also Changgyeong-gung is famous for cherry trees. The Japanese planted thousands of cherry trees in the park. Sorry. So when I was writing my thesis, my advisor told me, never say why they did this. You're just doing a thesis, so there's no way you know. But these people wrote whole books about it, and they say why the Japanese did this. If it's a Korean academic, they did it because they wanted to shame Korea and I think I have some quotes here. Yeah, this is from Michael Kim. He wrote, to demystify and desacralize a space that had long been off limits to the public during Chosun. And so that's the common attitude that these Korean scholars have. If they're a non-Korean academic, the story usually goes like this. It's unmistakably modeled after Tokyo's Goemyo Park, a battleground between the forces of the past and modernity. And Ueno zoological and botanical gardens were, according to Ian Miller, that's his first name, Ian, indexes an abstract and universal civilization that raised the government and academic entities in Japan to that rarefied level of a society that had the resources to collect, study, and classify life on Earth by 1900. And to Todd Henry, it was to foster an establishment of civic morality and thus bring about harmonious cooperative life. Is the reason that the Japanese were doing this. And many of you, but some of you know me, I often say that I'm half Korean because I've lived here for so long. So what I think falls halfway between these people. And I wrote in a thesis, this process in effect covered over Joseon's efforts to develop a modern nation state as evident by the trams, conversations, and lines uncovered by Henry's study of the modernity grasped at by Kim Hong-jong's concessions to foreign business interests. So Korea was trying to modernize in the same way Japan was modernizing, but after Japan gained control of it, it cut all of that off. And I would often get in arguments with my classmates who were in Japanese studies, and they would say, no, they were just all about building a modern empire. They wanted to create to be part of the empire. They weren't trying to shame Korea. And to that, I'd like to show them these postcards. On the left is Emperor Hirohito, facing forward, looking very regal, authoritarian. On the right, these are a postcard of scenes of Seoul from the Japanese Tourism Bureau. At the top is lines from a song that was popular at the time. And the refrain went, in the twilight of his kingdom, the king walks with 4 or 5 servants looking downward. And here is presumably King Kojong walking with his back, heading in toward, not heading away, instead. And so what really amazed me were these books. I found them in the art library at my university. And it's the Prince Yi Museum catalog, volume 1 and 2. One for paintings, and one for sculpture and porcelain objects. And these were published from 1912 to 1943 in English and Japanese. And they're still in libraries all over the world. Some points about this. So just instead of reading, I'll just tell you. So lots of scholars talk about how the Japanese at the time were pillaging the graves of the Chosun kings, and in their laws, the academics could get into Chosun tombs, but they couldn't touch the tombs of the imperial family in Japan. And there are also people who wrote about that the Japanese were selling the objects, so they were trying to make money, and trying to build up an art market by showing how rare and expensive celadon was, because they controlled the celadon, they were getting it from the tombs. If you don't know, the celadon is the green-colored porcelain, so that Koryo was famous for. So also what struck me from these books were these 3 objects. The upper one, the Bodhisattva and the painting, the thunder god. I lived in Korea a long time, I've been to Korean museums a lot, I've never seen these. So I went, where are these from? And they look very Japanese, they didn't look Korean to me. And the dog it stuck out because it was listed as being painted by Kim Hong-do. Kim Hong-do is one of my favorite Korean painters. So I was angered that how can anyone say Kim Hong-do painted this painting? And if you were going to show Kim Hong-do paintings, why would you pick this one to show? But these will come back later, so I'll just skip over them now. But I did speak to the curator of East Asian gallery in my university museum, and she said that she thinks the Japanese picked these not because they look Japanese, but because they were Pan-Asian. So this style was very common in Korea, Japan, and China at the time. So the Japanese were trying to stress the uniformity of Asian culture, not so much as trying to just pick things that appeal to Japanese. So here are some Kim Hong-do paintings, if you don't know about him. And what the Japanese did not only with the books, they would also send out exhibitions. And I found the catalog for one of these. And so it here is talking about how the Koreans has a lot. There's a collection of Korean, Manchurian, Mongolian, Tibetan art. And there were much more from Korea because of the exhibitions and excavations that were going on. And also it talks about Korea has made it a splendid type of national art to about the 4th century. There is material from early terms like that in but it also, as a nation, Korea claims continuity about as old as the oldest in the Korean world. So this was an idea that was commonly spoken about from the Japanese and Western writers, that Korea was just sort of calcified, solidified, it didn't change during Chosun. In Koryo, the art was very high, but during Chosun, everything just slid and didn't change. So that finishes off the first period. And this is going to the authoritarian period. And this was the height of Changgyeong-gung's popularity. I can't say that by statistics because I couldn't find attendance records. I could find them before and after, but during, there were no attendance records. But I think without a doubt, you'll see that during this period is when the most people visited Changgyeong-gung. And also through this book, the 80th anniversary of Korean zoos, I got the animal over time. So you can see like that right in 1942 they start to drop. Ian Miller talks about in the Tokyo zoos, the Japanese ordered the zookeepers to kill the animals as a sign of sacrifice that had to be made to the empire as the Americans grew closer to the main lands. The zookeepers were Korean, by the way, in the Tokyo Zoo. And of course, they were Koreans in Changgyeong-gung. But Mr. Oh, who wrote this book, said that they wouldn't poison the animals. They would either say, oh, we can't find the poison, we don't know where it is, or they would give it in such a small dose that it didn't actually kill the animals. So in 1945, when the Koreans took over the zoo from the Japanese, half the animals were still alive. But during the Korean War, they were all killed and eaten by hungry soldiers and civilians. But the important thing here is that if the zoo was really seen as a disgracing Korean culture and society, it would have been very easy for Syngman Rhee, the first president of Korea, to close down the zoo. But they didn't. And one of the points about like macro being in the micro, Isingman, Mr. Oh, the zoo administrator said, just ignore the zoo. He just left it to himself. So they actually had to go out and like beg rich Koreans to give money or companies, and poor zoos would also donate animals. So they got the zoo going again, and the park. But during that time period, the Isingman period, not much was really going on in the zoo. So again, I want to go back to art. And the Korean government started publishing these guidebooks about Korea. And very similar to the Welcome Society. Yes, Doctor?
Wasn't that series of books published by the forerunner of our previous employer?
It very well could have been. I was going to say we have some employees. I myself worked at Korea.net, which is in charge of promoting Korean culture outside of the world. So the thing is that, like the Welcome Society books, these books say we have no connection to the Korean government. We're civilians that just want to promote Korean culture. And in their pages are advertising from companies that are largely owned by the government at that time. And again, apart from what to say, there was another exhibition, Masterpieces of Korean Art, and it depicts the essence of Korean culture, that was a quote, as selected by a committee of 15 Korean officials and art experts and 2 US curators. The exhibit and resulting book are indicative of these image makers, a heavy reliance on US aid and pieces excavated, cataloged, and first displayed in the Prince Yi Museum. The US Army packed the 187 treasures, and the US Navy shipped them over to tour in 8 US museums. So in the Masterpieces of Korea exhibition was a painting of the dog that I showed you earlier. But this time it said that the artist is unknown. It used to be believed that it was Kim Hong-dong, but now people are not sure who the artist is. And then in Victorian Korea was a picture of the dog, also in the 1957 exhibition. But at this time they're saying directly, artist unknown. And this was the last time I saw this dog painting. For all the time that all the books that I looked at in English. In the Korean publications, especially art publications, there would be some pictures of it, usually saying the artist is unknown, it's important for its style. But I never saw it in anything promoting Korean history or culture. And now here's something I want to make sure I got across. So, masterpieces of Korean art, Victorial Korea, facts about Korea, and similar publications produced in the authoritarian period continued to laud the artistry of pre-Chosun dynasties, assigning the height of national art to Koryo and Shiba, and of architecture to Pinjie, just as the Japanese before them had. But Chosun creations, particular paintings, began to receive praise. This is a poem. Compared to Koryo and Shiba, the Yi work was austere, almost puritanical in taste. The difference we come to learn a few years later is in the Yi's Confucian bent. And another quote, art as a whole gradually declined under the Yi dynasty. Strong advocacy of Confucianism, which replaces Buddhism, caused the neglect of architectural and sculptural art. The Japanese invasion between 1592 and 1598 destroyed countless monuments. However, paintings and calligraphy flourished in this period among the aristocratic classes. Though Koryo was praised for movable type and other novel inventions, the same publications claim that in the scientific field, few advances were made during that earlier dynasty. So they were using the same collection, the same methods as the Japanese, but very slowly changing. And you know, like National Treasure number 32, National Treasure number 35, the Japanese did that, started the system, and Isingman continued it, but he just changed the numbering at some point. So, and that brings us to this. Women in Hanbok and palaces, which is what Kendall focused on. And I started to look at the women in Hanbok and palaces and other pictures in the palaces and who was shown and what was shown. And even though I didn't have many books to work with, I think there's a clear pattern. So in 1955 to 64, yes, most of the women were Hanbok, but a lot of them were in modern dress. And then it evens out, 65 to 74, and then by far, women in modern dress are more important. And 1985 to 94, the beginning of the civilian period, they're even, and men in Hanbok start to come back. And today, if you look at books, men in Hanbok are actually as many as women in modern clothes. But I should say it's not men in Hanbok, it's men Hanbok. Because, yeah, of course, during the Chosun era, only males or eunuchs could be palace musicians. But now, when they do reenactments in the palace, a lot of women are musicians, but they're wearing male Hanbok. So that's why I counted that as male Hanbok. Okay. And here is why I told you that Changgyeong-gung was most popular during this period. I hope these pictures will convince you that it's the truth. These are people lining up to get tickets to the Cherry Blossom Festival. And when I was doing my research, I was in the library and there was a Japanese friend next to me and he knew what my thesis was about. I was collecting pictures. And he said, oh, this is Japan, it's not Korea. I said, no, it's Korea. I was also shocked. But it's from a Korean blog, and this is the caption that was with the blog. Picnickers would go to Changgyeong-gung and lose track of time, relishing spring flowers on into the night. And there's a Korean who wrote about the flowers, the cherry blossoms, and 2008. And this is what she wrote about. Her name is Hyun-Suk Kim. And she emphasizes that while many colonial period Koreans discussing the blossoms adopted the Japanese term sakura for the Korean bollpot, the flower never came to convey the same bittersweet sense of fleeting transition that it does for the Japanese. And this is her quote. To Koreans, cherry blossoms were never far removed from being a seasonal interest, a brightly blossoming, splendid spring flower. She goes on to say that while the Japanese prefer to sit under the trees for a long time with dear ones, Koreans prefer to file past on the blossoms among large crowds and take in the stream of branches rather than bask under the canopy of a few. So I think she must be a very young Korean because clearly Koreans used to enjoy basking under a few of the branches long into the night. And the long lines of cherry blossoms now along Namsan Tower or on Yeouido, those are the cherry trees from Changgyeong-gung. They were taken out and moved to those locations. And the military government knew the danger of having a bunch of cherry blossoms in a closed area So that's why they put them in long rows, so it would be easy for crowds to see them. And no damage, no danger. Everyone could see them, that's one benefit. And also there's no danger of accidents happening. This, going back to the macro and the micro, I call this the miracle on the one. Sort of add fun. So this is what Park Chung-hee did to Changgyeong-gung when the Korean economy started to pick up. And it started to pick up in large part because of trade with Japan, reparations from Japan. So he modernized the zoo, and this cable car was actually put in 1962. And I wanted to show you a link because it's a newsreel and it's very fun. Here's the new cable car. And you can see that the Koreans don't look sad about being in Changgyeong-gung. They look quite happy to be there, seeing the new cable car. This one, yeah. But you can see how bad my Korean is. I thought this was ticket office. Yeah, Changgyeong-gung, and that's the specimen museum. So. This is very important part actually. So the changes undertaken in the 1960s and 70s were designed to outdo rather than undo colonial Japan's broad strokes. Grandiose additions to the zoo and botanical garden dwarf or replace some colonial era structures. Crowds swarmed in for the new amusement park rides and annual cherry blossom festivals. Visitors were told that the park was originally a gift from the late Chosun King, and its carnival-like atmosphere seemed to exemplify Korea's growing wealth and status. So kept out of view were chronicles of the past and present ties to Japan that had been instrumental to the construction of both the original and the new park. And now I'd just like to show you some pictures from the park. And going back to palimpsest, here's the old greenhouse, and these large domes were built behind them. The zoo was expanded. The Crystal Palace was torn down, and this Temple of Heaven restaurant was built. And you can see the amusement park rides and the cable car. Museum historian Sean Rose describes the museum exhibits as a way to link individual citizens' lives to an overarching narrative of a desired state-sponsored and envisioned collective through an intersection of competing official and vernacular expressions. So I think that's the point that I want to stress here. I'm not saying that everyone sees the same thing and believes the same things. Always there are people who see other things and think things, but these tourist sites and museums are sort of a way to balance what it should be the official description of a place. And these are just more pictures that I like. Also, I think that's from Victoria, Korea. And this the Edward Adams. I don't know if any of you ever know him. He wrote about gas. He's retired in Arizona. I hope he's still alive. Okay, I tried to reach out to him, but I got no response. But he wrote lots of choice books about Korea, so I got a lot of pictures and information from him. So this is captured from one of his books. In the heart of Seoul's Changgyeong-gung, with its zoo, gardens, and children's amusement park, has much for a family on a day's outing. And this is from a book written for the Seoul Olympics in 1983, which is unbelievable. If anyone wants to study misogyny, please get this book. You won't believe the things, the way he describes Korean women and their purpose. And here he says, the most popular palace is Changgyeong-gung Palace, or as it is most commonly called, Changgyeong-wan, which was the official residence of the Yi Dynasty kings. From every corner of the country, Changgyeong-gung is visited year-round by young and old alike during the spring months of April and May. The parks is especially beautiful and open in the evening hours for cherry blossoms. Again, I want to quote from my thesis, the miracle on the Han, the popular moniker for the Park Chung-hee administration's reliance on highly educated, productive workforce and infusion of Vietnam War-related U.S. government funds added to Japanese capital and business models to rapidly develop South Korea's economy, has been well documented. Pai and Sunny Park, in their separate studies focus instead on the utilization of Japanese templates to design Korea's post-colonial cultural and tourism policies. These policies are manifest in concurrent changes that occur in Changgyeong-gung through independence, civil war, and the intense political, economic, and social restructuring under Park Chung-hee and Chun Woo-hwan. The imperative of Korea's military dictators was to make Korea an industrial power. Only when they rejected the opposition's calls for national cultural resurgence began to resonate with the population was an effort made to reclaim Changgyeong-gung for the Joseon and for the extension of South Korea today and in the future. Now, this is from another book, government-sponsored book, Korea 20 Years. And it says, in the second year of Kim Seong-jong, 1907, a zoological botanical gardens were established on the palace grounds and open to the public. So in the authoritarian period, that was the way. Maybe Seong-jong established the greenhouse. They might mention that the Japanese did it, but a lot of times it was just passive tense. They just occurred. The zoo was built, and and then also quoting Adams over there on the right. Now the delightful park contains Seoul City Zoo and an amusement facility. Only a few buildings remain, which suggests that the area served as a detached palace during the Yi Dynasty. A botanical garden was established on the grounds in 1907 by order of the king. The title was changed from Kung to Wan at this time. The Japanese authorities developed Changgyeong-gun into a zoo with the subtle intent to weaken the influence of the king. However, it was greatly expanded after the war years. The park and zoo are well worth a visit, especially in the spring, and many paths are lined with Japanese flowering cherry. So, toward the end of the authoritarian period, it starts to creep in that the Japanese did this, and they did it to desacralize the space or to embarrass the Koreans or make the Koreans appear uncultured, especially the Joseon monarchy. And 1983 to 1984 was the restoration of the park. And it would be easy to say that, I wish I didn't think about that, it would be easy to think that it was the democratization movement that pushed for the restoration of the park. But actually, Park Chung-hee, in his last 5-year plan, before he was assassinated, had spelled out for the park to be relocated, the zoo to be closed down, and the amusement park to be relocated to Seoland. What is Seoland today used to be Changgyeong-gun. So that was all in Park Chung-hee's plan. And also it's very interesting reading about Park Chung-hee was saying, we have to accept the money from the Japanese, we have to do this now so we can make Korea strong. And when Korea is strong, then we can get rid of the Japanese, which something you don't often hear, but it came up again and again in the readings. And a lot of Koreans will tell you, oh, it was humiliating, the animals were in the king's residence. This is the only picture of an animal near the palace, because the zoo was in areas that had been all destroyed. So this was just when they were leaving the zoo, and when they brought in, they passed the palace gates, but otherwise they weren't right next to Joseon palace structures. So, and this brings us to the civilian period, which I call hyper-Josephication. So Park Chung-hee is trying to outdo the Japanese, and the civilian administrations are trying to erase any Japanese culture, and also links to the authoritarian past. So, another passage I'd like to read. For government officials in the nation's democratic era, eliminating all messages of Japan and extension of those of the old collaborative juntas has long been as a primary objective. After restoration grounds have largely stayed the same. So again, I don't need to talk about the buildings, because the buildings have looked like this since about 1988 when the park reopened. This building was rebuilt, and these were rebuilt. These parts were rebuilt. But basically, not too much has been restored. What they now focus on is bringing the Joseon era to life, and through reenactments. And there are these quite lavish displays. And now the Joseon rulers who lived there are mentioned in guidebooks. So you start to see Sado talked about in guidebooks. I'm very happy for this. The reenactments are incredible and unfortunately not that well advertised. I just stumbled upon this one in 2010. But something that bothers me about the reenactments, they're also often tied into popular culture. And in Korea, there's been a wave of movies where they talk about Sado Seja being the victim of the conspirators, and that he was a sage ruler who wanted to reform Korea, but people who wanted to maintain power thwarted his ambitions and lied to the king and got him killed. And as I told her, I cried when I read her memoirs. I think, and also some Koreans will say, oh, she just lied. She was trying to protect her family because they were a part of the royal faction. The woman's writing is unbelievable. This was like a century before Freud, and she describes King Yongjo's OCD behavior. He's touching his ears like 4 or 5 times before he goes into a building, or having to wash it. Whenever he hears certain words, he has to wash his hands. She also describes her husband's vestophobia, which is fear of clothing. Her husband would tear up his clothes, rip them off, and she would have to spend her own family's money to go and buy material to keep it from the king so he wouldn't know that this was going on. And vestophobia is caused when you're publicly humiliated by your dress. I read a case where a Taiwanese soldier had vestophobia and similarly would tear up his clothes or run around naked. And Sado, when he was young, was constantly humiliated by his father, who would criticize him for the way that he was dressed. So the fact that this woman was so perceptive, I can't believe that she was just making up that her husband was mentally ill. Not to mention the fact that she would talk about him beating a consort to death and coming to her chambers with the severed head of a servant. So she went through a lot, and so did he. She also says he's very sagacious and wise and loving, which is quite true to someone with schizophrenic bipolar disorder. So I'm sure he was a very intelligent man. And so this is a scene from Isan, which is a popular drama. And here, King Jong-go, the future King Jong-go, at age 10, is seeing his father for the last time. According to Lady Kendall, this didn't happen. When Jong-go was ordered to go into the rice chest, she petitioned the king for permission to leave and take Jong-go to her family's residence, and he granted that because he didn't want his son to have to listen to his father. Because for 8 days until he died, Sado was crying out and wailing. But also, in Chosun, as in North Korea today, if someone is convicted of a crime, their family is convicted as well. So if Sado had been a criminal, his wife and son could have been also been sentenced to death, or at least banished from the court. So by getting them out of sight, out of mind, or protecting them, and by not charging Sado with the crime, the Cheongjo would be in line to inherit the throne. If Cheongjo was a criminal, if Sado was a criminal, Cheongjo would never be able to accept the throne. And if Sado was truly a member of the royal family, you couldn't touch the body of a royal person. You couldn't cause harm to him. So there was no way to execute him. So when I first heard about the rice chest king, I thought, what kind of people are these? Who would even think of something like this? But because of the Kim Bush translation of Lady Kikang's writing, it was ingenious, very sad, very tragic, but it allowed Cheongjo to inherit the throne from Yongjo, and Cheongjo went on to be one of Korea's greatest kings. So when I talk about popular culture influencing, so this was the guidebook in 2010, 2014. In English, notice they say, it is believed that Crown Prince Sado was a victim of conspiracy by his political adversaries. But in Korean and Japanese, you have groundless rumors spread by the Northern faction and perpetuated by Princess Oran, the Sado's sister. So, yeah. And more reenactments. This one was a series called, The Daily Life of the Chosen King. But in this particular daily life scene, Cheongjo discovers the diaries of Yongjo, where he says that Sado was an innocent victim, and he regrets his son being killed. And Cheongjo goes into a rage and orders the execution of Noran faction people. It's a very popular scene in Yisan and other dramas, but according to Lady Kegong, it never happened. So it's true that her husband's father killed her husband, and it's also true that her son killed her brother and her uncle because they were members of the Noran faction, but it had nothing to do with him finding testament from Yongjo. He just genuinely loved his father he had fond memories of his father and wanted to punish the people who were going against him. And also there's, of course, political intrigue going on in the court, as usual. So I have to also take Lady Taekyung's words, even though as much as I love her writing, in a way she was trying to protect her family. Because if her son was truly one of the wisest kings in Korea, why did he just kill her brother and uncle? I mean, he must have known something was going on there. So today, if you visit the Changgyeong-gung, this is the site on the site where Lady Taekyung wrote her memoirs. And if you look at the last line, during the Japanese occupation, Changgyeong-gung, a modern royal library, was built here. It was removed in 1992. So they don't mention the museum at all. And when I was writing my thesis and talking to Koreans about the museum, most Koreans have no idea that there was a museum in Changgyeong-gung. More reenactments. This is a happier time. Youngjo was visiting Lady Taekyung to congratulate her on the birth of Chongjo. And I wanted to stress that the Korean government, of course, is still putting out, sponsoring literature, talking about Korean history and culture and art, which of course they should do. But now, we're in the Japanese era, Chosen, with art sort of covered up, it's very, very well flaunted now. And this is Rigwe, the procession of that's a painting of some kind of royal process. In this case, it's the procession of Chongjo to Sado's grave on the 60th anniversary of his birth. So, and they talk about Kim Hong-do working. This is controversial. Some people say Kim Hong-do didn't work on this, but anyway, they want to stress that these paintings. And I want to also read a part from my thesis. So, and this is describing one scene of this process that's not pictured here, but nearly 1,800 courtiers, soldiers and servants on foot, riding atop one of 779 horses, are carried in palanquins across the Han River upon a bridge made atop specifically prepared floating pontoons. The depiction of monarchical power, wealth, engineering, and scholastic prowess is also exceptional for something even rarer among most depictions of Chosun. Subjects, rulers, and slaves communing all together and smiling. And then, going on, these are taken from the National Museum now. And have you seen these objects before? Yeah, so they're quite national treasures. But if you notice this Doksu, that's from the Prince-Yi Museum. It was moved to Doksu, the palace in Doksu. Not everything that says Doksu is from the Prince-Yi Museum because it was mixed with another museum that was there. But I know for sure these objects were in the Prince-Yi Museum because I saw them in that volume, that component volume. And but now we're before the Japanese hid Puchong-ware and white porcelain and really stressed celadon. In the National Museum, Puchong-ware, white porcelain, they're equal to the celadon that exhibited. So those are stressed. And going back to my Japanese studies colleagues, the Japanese had the white porcelain and Puchong, but they chose not to display it. You can see, don't see the numbers here. And so that's why I say that it's out of the shadows. The Koreans brought them out of the shadows. But another thing that came out of the shadows at Bodhisattva, at the beginning of my lecture that I saw that I said looked very Japanese, it's now part of the permanent display in the Korean National Museum. So I think Koreans aren't afraid to show something that might look sort of Japanese. And also the dog painting is back. And Kim Hong-do is listed as the artist. So I think, again, that shows that Koreans have much confidence that they can decide themselves what is their culture, what is their art. And I think, like me, when I saw, there's no way Kim Hong-do did that painting, but I have a friend who's an art historian, and she said that famous painters, they get bored. It's so easy for them to paint in the style that they're accustomed to. They want to try something new. And so she said it could be that Kim Hong-do learning about Western paintings, just wanted to try his hand at it. And there was a collection of Changgyeong-gung paintings I saw, and there were paintings that looked similar to this. The dog picture wasn't in it, but so whether it's really Changgyeong-gung or not, I'm happy to see it. And my coworker, who's sitting over here, will tell you this is my screensaver of our desk. So thesis, synthesis, and antithesis. By that I just mean like in the beginning of the authoritarian period, they didn't discuss the Japanese, the palace, the zoo, and the botanical garden were created by the last king of Changgyeong-gung, just somehow were passively created in a passive voice. And then in the civilian period, for a time, there was a lot of stress was put on how the Japanese had degraded Korea by putting a zoo in the palace. So here's one line. During Japan's occupation of Korea, the palace suffered the indignity of being turned into a zoo, demoted to Changgyeong-gung Garden. And this was done by supported by the Art Council of Korea and Korean Foundation. A lot of the books that I studied had Korean Foundation stickers in them. But in the bottom is the description of Changgyeong-gung today, just taken off the website. And it says, Changgyeong-gung Palace was built in 1483 by King Seongjong, the ninth king of the Joseon dynasty, to take care of the wives of the preceding kings. Compared to other palaces, the size of the palace is compact and simple. While visiting Changgyeong Palace, it is recommended you visit nearby Changgyeong-gung Palace as well. I had to throw that in because the Korean National Tourism Office will sort of push people away from Changgyeong-gung and toward Changgyeong-gung in the secret garden because they think it's much more beautiful. And admittedly, it is more beautiful, but if you know about Changgyeong-gung's history, it's also a very fascinating place to visit. Oh, I should plug. Here's a good place for a plug. On Saturday, I'm doing a tour of Changgyeong-gung. If you're interested, please sign up for that. And so continuing on, during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese built a zoo on the site and renamed the palace Changgyeong-wan, meaning Changgyeong Garden. Since 1987, the palace has been reconstructed and now resembles its original form. It should be, and now resembles its original form. More than it did before, it doesn't resemble its original form. But the thing is, I like this because it's just very neutral. It admits that the Japanese built it, there's no criticism. It's just, the Japanese built this museum. Again, I think it shows that Korea is much more confident in its identity than it used to be. And lastly, here's another physical change that's going on in the city of Seoul allocated 58 billion won, or $57 million in 2008 to reconnect Changgyeong-gung to the royal shrine Gyeongmyo via 500-meter wide vegetation-covered overpass across the 3-kilometer-long traffic-laden Yonggongmo. So I was hoping that it did. Kim Changi come today? Oh, so you were asking about the controversy. You were asking me, where do you stand on the controversy? I wasn't aware that there was a controversy. Is there a controversy about building this?
We talked about it right before your speech, but we have an idea.
Oh, okay. All right.
So the general wisdom goes that once the authorities want to go back to as it was, then we shouldn't touch. And actually, Gyeongmyo Shrine and the Changgyeong Palace and the Changgyeong Palace were on the same compound. Yeah, physically, but spiritually, Gyeongmyo Royal Shrine was much higher than that, and nobody can come in. But actually, they were connected.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, thanks. And with that, it's coming up on an hour, so very quickly, so these are the books the tourism books that I read for my thesis. And this color green shows if it said that the Changgyeong-gung was founded during the Koryo dynasty. Green, if it said it was founded during the Joseon dynasty. Blue. So you can see in the authoritarian period, most people said it was originally Koryo Palace. And during the civilian period, that switched exactly to where it says it was a Joseon Palace. And the red color, yellow is like a neutral description. And pink means a little bit critical, so like Adam's saying, with a subtle intent would be pink. But if someone described and criticized the Japanese for what they did, it's dark red. So in the authoritarian period, there was very little mention of the Japanese, in a critical sense, at least. And then in the civilian period, it became common for people to criticize the Japanese. So, and with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Questions?
It's really more of a comment. Thank you for an outstanding presentation. But I think my understanding of the controversy is that when the Japanese built the road, which separated Jonggyeong from the palace, many people felt the Pangsu was destructive. The feng shui was broken. And so the controversy is kind of, is it worth spending all this money now just to maintain those, to restore those feng shui principles? Is that an appropriate use of the money? Because I think that's one of the big issues, is that people were offended by the way the road, and it's just whether is it worth restoring.
I understood the controversy of the road being built. I didn't, my friend had said, where do you stand on the controversy of rebuilding, reconnecting it? And that struck me. I was surprised. Why is there a controversy? Why wouldn't it just be reconnected?
And I wonder if at the very beginning you mentioned the direction the palace was facing, and I wonder if that has to do with that it was built for women. It was built for the wives, and if perhaps that could account for the direction it's facing.
Yeah, that's an interesting part. But the crown prince is there too. Yeah, that's. Any other?
I was like in France, and I watched the newspaper. It said that the cherry blossoms that we sent, from Japan to the U.S. or in Washington D.C., they were actually from Jeju Island because at the time it was part of the Japanese Empire. So I was wondering where you said that the Japanese brought in cherry blossoms, where those came from.
I would assume that it came from Japan, or samplings were started in Korea, and, but they look pretty good. Even from like there's pictures of 1910, and they look quite high. So I don't know. Does anyone know where the cherry trees came from?
Cherry trees, I think, in DC were also quite large at the time.
Oh, maybe. Yeah.
So, because that was in 1912, and so
So if they could survive from Changgyeong to Washington D.C., they could easily survive from Japan. So.
that's the thing I'm wondering is if they were actually really from Japan,
Oh, it's
or if they were really from Korea.
Yeah.
And they said, oh, this is Japan at the time, so we're going to have this change.
Yeah, could be, yeah, but still symbolically. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And as a Korean, we have never thought about the propaganda from the existing authorities. I think it's a very good perspective, and I was very inspired when I saw your thesis. Only thing is that Changgyeong-gung was used to be a Korea summer palace. It was not established.
Yeah.
So please be careful.
Oh, but in terms of studies, I never say what exists. I say what people said exists.
Okay. So, but you have the same portion.
Yeah.
So,
But that's because these are books. In this book, it's mentioned that this was a Korean palace, and it's a Korean palace, it's a Korean palace. In this book, it's a Chosun palace, Chosun palace, Chosun.
is it on your own diagram now?
Yeah, that's my diagram.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
it has the same portion according to the diagram. So people might think
Oh, it's here.
the Paris used to be there.
Yeah.
And to the German's question, the Changgyeong-gung is the only palace that faces east.
Right.
So it is quite extraordinary. And as you say, in late 15th century, when the Changgyeong was first established, there were three queen dowagers, as you know.
Dowagers.
Yeah, queen dowagers. So Changgyeong-gung was first constructed only for those elderly women in the royal house. And you know, at the time, the ninth king Songjong said, "This is a palace for my elderly queen dowagers, my mother and grandmother, but I don't intend to go there and rule. So because king should face and rule the country. So it is Paris though. I don't intend to go there and to rule. So it doesn't matter. It is what he said exactly. And one of the maybe one of the reasons he faces is and because there was a little space, and it has only 2 gates before you go to the court. So it is like a little bit very unique. And if you go there, usually other palaces, the main hall is the central part, and the king's chamber. But in Changgyeong-gung, the center place was occupied by
The dowager.
now Queen Dowager's chamber. So it is very unique. I suggest you should go there.
Absolutely.
Instead of there.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? That's it.
Question?
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's too late. Well, this is really, thank you for your time. This is off the top of the day. But, when it comes down to what a person saw, talking about Paris, they say, I think there's a lot of countries where we use as a kind of event, summit event or commercial event. What do you think of that? It's okay or it's recommendable?
I think it's okay because it's promoting awareness of Korea abroad.
To what extent?
It depends. I mean, I know they have fashion shows in the palaces, so that's kind of pushing
It's
it.
a commercial event.
But also, I'm only half Korean, so I don't feel, I say half Korean. So I don't feel I have the right to tell you what you should do with your palace. So, but if it were me, I know that it's hard for government agencies to get money, so it's a way for them to generate money. It's also showing the palaces to people who might not otherwise see it. So long as they weren't doing anything too disrespectful, I wouldn't mind.
So from her comment, am I correct in concluding that if the king was going to live there or visit the palace, then the gate needed to be facing south, but if it's only the women who would be living there, then the gate could be facing east?
But that's what she's saying. I don't know. I'm not an expert on Joseon era architecture. I do know that according to Bongsu, the feng shui, the palace should be facing the south.
The civilian government, so-called, from 1988, restoring the palace, and at the same time demolishing systematically all the detached palaces that have been used by the royal family until all the children of Changgyeong, systematically destroying that heritage to restore a big house.
Yeah.
And so, do you know why there's that plan?
I don't work with the Korean government anymore. Even when I did, I was in a very low position, so I wouldn't know. I think it all has to do with money revenue. That if you have a big palace, a lot of tourists can come in at one time. If it's a small place, you can.
What was the tall white building up on the hill?
The big museum.
The white.
It was. Sometimes it looks
The
white.
archive.
Yeah, that was the museum.
The museum said it was a big, long building.
No, let me get it back. That's the museum.
That's the museum.
And it was red brick, but sometimes it doesn't.
On the hill there was more like a pagoda building. More like this one.
Yeah, that was the archive. It was the original archive.
It was because that building. Why was it destroyed?
In 1983, they were going to restore the palace. So because it wasn't part of the original palace,
It was built by the Korean monarchy.
I think that's down Daeguk era structure, from what I recall.
Yeah, but still, I think and that's why I called in the civilian area, hyper Josephification. That they were going back to, and they, in a way, that's a good point. They're denying that Korea was modernizing, and Korea was modernizing at that time. It was cut short by the Japanese. So
It's not a Japanese building, but you go Japanese because it's modern.
So in all the history that I've heard, the palace was built by King Sejong for his father.
that's in some of the guidebooks. That's why I said, how does palace?
And then later, Sunjong rebuilt it for the Dowager Queens.
Yeah.
So that's even confusing.
Yeah, so that's why I tried to say that I'm not saying one thing, I'm just reporting what was told in its books. And also, if you don't have any questions, I would just like to hear from someone who visited, if your impressions of what you thought of it, if anyone would like to share that.
I find it interesting that the Sado, I think I'm about my students never need to use a microphone. I think that whenever Koreans think of Sado Sejong, they think of Suwon. And all the used to be tourism. All the tourism-related things related to him, you can sit in the chest and all that.
Oh, that's
Suwon. And I think most Koreans don't even realize that he died there.
in the palace.
Yes,
Yeah.
because they think it happened in Suwon.
Well, I think
Because all the tourism-related infrastructure about him is there.
Yeah.
So can you explain that? Why they don't try to promote it?
That's the city of Suwon doing a better job than the city of Seoul. That's how I can explain that.
That makes sense.
And that's one of the reasons why I love this story so much, because so much of Korean tourism is tied to this family. They just not only do he dynasty, this family. And because if you walk along Changgyeong-gung, you see that leeway that in the tiles is there. And if you go to Suwon, you see the fortress. And their tombs are not far from that either. And tons of, like I said, movies and plays and books about
There
this.
was a shrine or tomb in the land in the ground was Seoul.
Yeah, and which another plug on Saturday we will go to that. Yeah, after we leave the palace.
Also,
It's just I should have included a picture. It's almost like it looks like a stable. It's just about from here to that wall, and of course a Korean room. But that's the only part that's left. And it was when Yeongjo killed Sado. Of course, he felt remorseful. By the way, Sado means feeling remorse, feeling of great remorse. Yeah, so feeling of sorrow. And he built a shrine for him. And when Cheongjo became the king, he built up that shrine and made it sort of like almost a little palace. And Lady Taegyeong's house that he also built for her, you could see it from that. She was able to look out and look at the shrine. You can't see now, it's a high rise for Seoul National Hospital. But yeah, and my friend took me to that. We got us inside the gate, so we could walk around. So there's foundations there, and I think there are plans to restore that.
Yeah.
So I visited the zoo maybe 1977, and it was horrific.
Okay.
It was just horrific. The animals were, what's the word? Maybe not diseased, but they just were emaciated. Thank you.
I saw
It was
a clip where a tiger had died. And they were
Yeah.
So-
There was no greenery.
And there was no green. It was just cages, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm so glad it's gone.
Yeah. So, I'm not a fan of any zoos anyway. Yeah, now it's in Seoul, so. But thank you for, sure. Did you ever get into any of those buildings?
Not in the archive museum building. Was locked and closed by that point in time, but it was still there.
Wasn't there a big bird house?
Yeah. I was just thinking there was something else. Yeah. I think you're right, Suzanne.
Yeah.
Like a big aviary sort of a thing.
That picture from the colonial times, the
Yeah.
kids are looking at the bird house.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
I can't see your picture. You said something about the cherry trees were dangerous where they were all together
Oh, no, that, because of the crowds. You saw how massive
because of the
crowds
crowds.
were.
Wasn't Park Chung-hee worried about demonstrations?
Yeah,
Wasn't
sure.
that the danger that he was worried
Well,
about?
that could be a part too. But also think that there must have been deaths, but that just the sheer number of people who can't get in, get them out.
Doesn't happen on, people don't die on the subway, they didn't die under the cherry trees.
Okay, that's
Okay.
okay.